A man gave a jacket to an elderly woman shivering in the cold. The next day, he saw her crying in front of his mother's grave. The clock struck 10 at night as Ethan Sawyer stood up, stretching after another endless day at the office. The lights of his elegant office shone with the same coldness as his empty apartment. He closed his laptop with a soft sigh and picked up his black leather briefcase. Everyone in the company respected him. He was the executive manager, a self-made man, an imposing figure, yet also unreachable. It was rumored that Ethan had no personal life, and in fact, it was true. Ever since his mother's death 20 years ago, he had filled his life with work, avoiding any real emotion. He took the elevator down to the building's lobby, where the doorman greeted him with a respectful nod. Ethan barely responded with a slight motion and stepped outside. The night wind greeted him with an icy bite, a reminder of the harsh winter gripping the city. He adjusted his coat and sank into his scar's collar, walking briskly toward the parking lot. There was something in the air that night, a sort of vibration. He couldn't identify. The city was wrapped in the typical calm of late workdays, but the silence seemed heavier than usual. He decided to take a small detour through the park in front of his building. It was a routine he sometimes followed, an unconscious attempt to break the monotony surrounding him. The park was deserted. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the mist curled around the trunks of the trees, creating ethereal figures. As he walked, he heard the soft crunch of dry leaves under his shoes. Suddenly, something caught his attention. On one of the benches, barely visible under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, was a hunched figure. Ethan stopped, frowning. It was an elderly woman, wrapped in a thin scarf and a coat that barely covered her shoulders. The sight unsettled him. The woman was trembling, violently shivering in the freezing night. Instinct told him to keep walking, to not get involved. But something about her, in the way she huddled over herself, made him stop. He approached slowly, struggling to find the right words. He wasn't used to talking to strangers, let alone someone in that situation. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked firmly, though a hint of concern in his voice surprised even him. The woman raised her head slowly, as if even that small gesture required immense effort. The eyes that met his were dull and filled with a sadness so profound that Ethan felt a knot in his throat. She seemed trapped in some distant place, oblivious to everything around her. I'm fine," she murmured, though her voice shook as much as her hands. Ethan noticed the thin fabric of her coat, clearly inadequate for the night's temperatures. Without thinking, he took off his own jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket, custom-made and of thick, warm material, contrasted sharply with the woman's fragile appearance. She looked at the garment with confusion and then glanced up at him. "No, you shouldn't," she stammered, shaking her head weakly. "It's all right. Keep it," Ethan interrupted, softly crouching down to meet her eye level. Something about this woman stirred an unusual compassion in him, a need to protect her from the harshness of the night. "Do you need me to take you somewhere? Do you have anyone I can call?" The woman closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, a solitary tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. There was nowhere to go. She whispered so faintly that Ethan had to lean in to hear her. "There's no help for people like me. There's no one. Only the cold." Ethan felt a shiver as he heard those words. There was something in her. The tone, in the stillness with which she spoke, touched him deeply. The moment an image of his mother flashed through his mind, with her warm smile and protective embrace. Ethan averted his gaze, suppressing the pain that stirred within him. "Are you sure there's nothing I can do for you?" he insisted, his voice softer than he would have expected from himself. The woman shook her head, gently lowering it, as if she didn't even have the strength to speak. The jacket seemed too big on her frail frame, But when she adjusted it with trembling hands, Ethan saw something he hadn't expected. Faint smile, just a flicker. A shadow of what must have once been an expression of joy. "Thank you," she murmured, and Ethan felt that the word carried a weight he didn't understand. He stayed by her side a moment longer, unsure of what to do. Call the police, a taxi? But the woman looked at him with eyes so full of resignation that he understood she didn't want any more help. Finally, he stood up and took a step back. "If you need anything," he began, but she wasn't listening anymore. The woman's gaze had drifted off into the night again as if he wasn't there. Ethan sighed and with one last worried glance walked away, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. He reached his car and got. In starting the engine through the windshield, he saw the elderly figure still sitting on the bench, wrapped in his jacket like a shield against the night's relentless cold. Before driving off, he thought of turning back, but forced himself to move on. Yet, something about her sad eyes and those desperate words kept echoing in his mind. As he drove to his apartment, the city lights blurred and somehow the silence inside his car seemed more oppressive than ever. Upon arriving home, he went to his study where his mother's photograph greeted him. He stared at it in the dim light. Emily Sawyer's face was illuminated only by the streetlight's reflection. "What am I doing?" he thought, feeling a slight tremor in his hands. That photograph was all that remained of her. Everything else had been buried under years of guilt and silence. That night, Ethan didn't sleep well. The image of the woman on the bench, with his jacket as her only refuge, haunted him in his dreams. He didn't know why, but he felt there was something more behind that woman, something that connected them in a way he didn't yet understand. And the next day he would find out what it was. The morning was grey and melancholic when Ethan rose from the couch feeling as if he hadn't slept at all. The first light of dawn timidly seeped through the curtains, casting long shadows in his living room as he poured himself a coffee. The elderly woman's face in the park came back to his mind, whispering questions with no answers. Why couldn't he stop thinking about her, that lost old woman? Her words filled with sadness and resignation, the way she shrank under the weight of the jacket he had given her. It was as if that brief encounter had left a crack in the fortress of indifference he had built around himself, and then a sudden impulse hit him. He had to go see his mother. Ethan never visited the cemetery the last time he had been. There was years ago, forced by Lauren during one of her few visits. Since then, he had avoided that place, as if getting close could unearth old ghosts. But something inside him pushed him to go. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the cold morning, guided by a feeling he couldn't explain. The cemetery was shrouded in a sepulchral calm. When he arrived, the gravestones rose like old sentinels, and the mist wrapped the gravel paths in a blanket of silence. Ethan walked slowly, each step echoing hollowly in the solitary atmosphere. The bare trees swayed gently under the wind, and a slight shiver ran down his spine as he approached the area where his mother was buried. Emily Sawyer, 1965-2004, read the simple headstone devoid of unnecessary embellishments. Ethan stood there staring at his mother's name engraved on the cold stone. Suddenly a movement caught his attention from the other side of the grave. Thin, hunched figure was kneeling. In front of the tombstone, his stomach tightened as he recognized the same old woman from the night before. "You," Ethan murmured, taking a step forward. Surprise and disbelief mingled in his voice. The old woman slowly lifted her head, and her tear-filled eyes met his in her trembling hands. The jacket Ethan had given her the previous night hung like a weight she couldn't bear. She looked more fragile in the daylight, as if the warmth she had shown under the Park Street lights had completely faded. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, not exactly sure what else to say. It took her a moment to respond when she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, broken by the restrained sobs. "I came To see her, she replied, not taking her eyes off the headstone. "It's been so many years since I last came, but when you gave me the jacket last night, I felt like she was giving me permission to come." The tears flowed freely down her cheeks, but the old woman made no effort to wipe them away. "Emily, she was the only friend I ever had, and I betrayed her." Ethan felt his entire world sway around him. A friend of his mother, betrayal. What was this woman saying? He crouched beside her, ignoring the cold that bit into his knees, trying to understand. "How did you know my mother?" he asked, his voice unsteady with disbelief. Mildred glanced at him sideways, and in her expression, Ethan saw a suffering so deep that it was almost unbearable. Mildred began, but the words seemed to cost her a great effort. "Emily," she swallowed hard, and Ethan saw the muscles in her jaw tense, as if she was struggling to find the courage to continue. "The best person I've ever known. She was everything. I could never be brave, kind, loyal." Her voice broke on that last whisper. Ethan stared at the woman, without blinking, every word of hers falling like a heavy blow onto his heart. He couldn't grasp what he was hearing. He had grown up, believing his mother was a simple and dedicated woman, trapped in a marriage with a man who barely valued her. But this elderly woman was describing someone else. Her Emily. He didn't know she trusted me. Mildred continued, her eyes fixed on the headstone. "But I was scared. I made a terrible mistake. And that mistake..." She brought her hands to her face, hiding her expression behind her bony fingers. "That mistake destroyed her, and everyone around her." The air grew denser, heavier, as Ethan tried to process what he was hearing. What was she saying? That this woman had done something that hurt his mother. Anger flared in his chest, mixed with a sensation of confusion that paralyzed him. "What mistake are you talking about?" he demanded, whispering through clenched teeth. Mildred looked at him with tear-filled eyes and shook her head. "No, I can't," she whispered. "It's too late to change what I did. I can't give her back what I took. I can't." Ethan took a step toward her, extending a hand, as if he could hold on to something tangible. "What did you do to my mother?" he asked, his tone low but filled with desperation. But Mildred just lowered her gaze, sobbing quietly. "All I can tell you is that she didn't deserve anything that happened to her. And it was my fault. Everything was my fault," she murmured, her voice choked with guilt, before Ethan could press her further. The old woman awkwardly stood up, staggering as if her legs could barely hold her weight. She returned the jacket with a slow, almost reverent gesture, as if she were giving back a treasure that was never hers. "Thank you," she whispered, and Ethan noticed that the word carried a tone of farewell. "But this jacket, it's too warm for someone who deserves to freeze." Ethan tried to stop her, but the old woman was already moving away, walking with unsteady steps among the gravestones, like a shadow slipping into the darkness of the past. "Wait," he called out, but Mildred didn't turn back. Within seconds, the woman disappeared into the morning mist, leaving him alone in front of his mother's grave. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan looked at the jacket, now hanging from his arm, feeling that in that brief encounter there was something deeply disturbing, something he couldn't just let go. "She was my only friend and I betrayed her." What did those words mean? How had she known his mother, and what could she have done to destroy her? Ethan's gaze lingered on Emily's gravestone, and a torrent of emotions hit him. Everything he thought he knew about his mother, about his family, teetered on the brink of collapse, determined to get answers. Ethan stood up, and with his heart racing headed to his car. There was one person who might shed some light on all this. His sister Lauren, as he drove away from the cemetery, the jacket hanging heavily from his hand. Ethan knew he wasn't going to let this go. The truth, whatever it was there waiting to be uncovered, and he was going to find it. no matter what it cost him. Lauren's Sawyer office was the complete opposite of Ethan's orderly world shelves, lined with legal documents, neatly stacked piles of papers, and a minimalist decor that radiated authority and professionalism. Ethan barely stepped through the door when his sister looked up, disbelief etched on her face as she put aside the report. She'd been reviewing Ethan. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not bothering to hide the surprise and irritation. Their relationship had grown distant since the day of the accident. The words left unsaid weighed more than those exchanged, though they had never openly discussed it. Ethan knew that Lauren blamed him for their mother's death on that fateful day. It had been him who insisted that Emily pick him up from school to take him to an event she hadn't wanted to attend. Everything that happened afterward was shrouded in a veil of guilt and resentment. "I need to talk to you," Ethan replied. Frowning, he didn't want to waste time with pleasantries. The old woman at the cemetery and their encounter the night before kept him teetering on the edge. "It's about Mom." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her frown deepening. With suspicion, Ethan saw her expression harden instantly, an emotional shield rising between them. "What about Mom?" she replied coldly. "There's nothing more to say, is there?" Ethan stepped closer and carefully unfolded the photograph he had found at the cemetery. Holding it out to his sister, Lauren hesitated, but finally took the picture. Her eyes scanned their mother's smiling face, and the man beside her, shock flickered across her features as she recognized the man. She whispered, her voice filled with a rare astonishment. Ethan had been him who insisted that Emily pick him up from school to take him to an event she hadn't wanted to attend. Everything that happened afterward was shrouded in a veil of guilt and resentment. "I need to talk to you," Ethan replied. Frowning, he didn't want to waste time with pleasantries. The old woman at the cemetery and their encounter the night before kept him teetering on the edge. "It's about Mom." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her frown deepening. With suspicion, Ethan saw her expression harden instantly, an emotional shield rising between them. "What about Mom?" she replied coldly. "There's nothing more to say, is there?" Ethan stepped closer and carefully unfolded the photograph he had found at the cemetery. Holding it out to his sister, Lauren hesitated, but finally took the picture. Her eyes scanned their mother's smiling face, and the man beside her, shock flickered across her features as she recognized the man. She whispered, her voice filled with a rare astonishment. Ethan had been him who insisted that Emily pick him up from school to take him to an event she hadn't wanted to attend. Everything that happened afterward was shrouded in a veil of guilt and resentment. "I need to talk to you," Ethan replied. Frowning, he didn't want to waste time with pleasantries. The old woman at the cemetery and their encounter the night before kept him teetering on the edge. "It's about Mom." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her frown deepening. With suspicion, Ethan saw her expression harden instantly, an emotional shield rising between them. "What about Mom?" she replied coldly. "There's nothing more to say, is there?" Ethan stepped closer and carefully unfolded the photograph he had found at the cemetery. Holding it out to his sister, Lauren hesitated, but finally took the picture. Her eyes scanned their mother's smiling face, and the man beside her, shock flickered across her features as she recognized the man. She whispered, her voice filled with a rare astonishment. Ethan had been him who insisted that Emily pick him up from school to take him to an event she hadn't wanted to attend. Everything that happened afterward was shrouded in a veil of guilt and resentment. "I need to talk to you," Ethan replied. Frowning, he didn't want to waste time with pleasantries. The old woman at the cemetery and their encounter the night before kept him teetering on the edge. "It's about Mom." Lauren narrowed her eyes, her frown deepening. With suspicion, Ethan saw her expression harden instantly, an emotional shield rising between them. "What about Mom?" she replied coldly. "There's nothing more to say, is there?" Ethan stepped closer and carefully unfolded the photograph he had found at the cemetery. Holding it out to his sister, Lauren hesitated, but finally took the picture. Her eyes scanned their mother's smiling face, and the man beside her, shock flickered across her features as she recognized Lauren. Averted her gaze. Ethan watched as she clenched her fists tightly, as if trying to contain the storm of emotions battling to break free. Finally, his sister's expression softened, but not with understanding, rather with a deep, profound sadness. Dad hated Henry Salazar because he was Mom's first love. She confessed, the words cutting through the air like a whip. They were together before she met Dad, before he saved her from poverty. Mom and Henry had plans to get married. But then Richard Sawyer showed up with his money, his power, and the determination to get everything he wanted. Ethan stepped back feeling as if the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. Lauren took a deep breath before continuing. Dad always said Henry was a traitor, that he tried to steal everything from him, but I know that wasn't true. What Henry stole was Mom. When Dad found out they were planning to run away, he did everything in his power to separate them. That's when that woman, Mildred Garcia, came into Mom's life. Ethan nodded, slowly feeling the pieces starting to fit together. Mildred, he murmured almost to himself. What role did she play? Lauren glanced at the photo on the desk, then looked back at him, her expression one of regret and exhaustion. She was Mom's best friend, she explained softly. But she had a young son, Roberto, and Dad took advantage of that. He offered her money protection for her son in exchange for telling him everything. Mom and Henry were planning. Mildred agreed and revealed all of their escape plans to Dad. Mom never knew her own friend had betrayed her, not until it was too late. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. His mother had been betrayed by the only person she trusted, trapped in a web of lies woven by Richard Sawyer himself. So Mildred betrayed Mom, he said, his voice unsteady. And Henry, what happened to him? Lauren looked away, pain clouding her eyes. Dad ruined him. He made up stories, accused him of embezzlement, and trying to destroy the family business. Henry was forced out of the city, his reputation shattered, and then Mom married Dad. Bitterness laced every word, but she never stopped. Loving Henry, silence fell between them, heavy and painful. Ethan sank into one of the chairs, trying to process what he had just heard all this time. He had believed his mother was just a victim of fate, but the truth was much more complicated, much darker. And what happened after that? He finally asked, after Lauren paused, gazing at the photo of their mother with infinite sadness. Mom moved on as best she could. She never mentioned Henry, at least not in front of us, but Dad. He knew she never forgot him. When he found that letter from Henry and realized she was planning to leave with him, it was the beginning of the end. Ethan leaned forward, his heart racing. And the accident, he whispered, was it really an accident? Lauren stared at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty and pain. I always wondered that, Ethan, but whether it was an accident or not, only one person knows. Mildred Garcia. Ethan jumped to his feet, his mind racing. He had to find Mildred again. He had to know what really happened that day for his mother's sake and his own. The truth, as elusive and painful as it seemed to be, was out there waiting to be uncovered without saying goodbye. He left the office, leaving Lauren staring blankly at the photo of their mother as if she too were trying to make peace with a past filled with shadows. Ethan left his sister's office with his mind in turmoil. Lauren's words still echoed in his head. Dad separated her from Henry. Mildred was the one who betrayed them, and the accident. Everything he thought he knew about his mother and his family was crumbling. He wandered aimlessly through the city streets, his gaze distant and his chest burning with confusion. He had to find Mildred Garcia again, but the old woman had disappeared without a Trace determined to get more information. Ethan returned to the cemetery the next day. The place, shrouded in a thick, silent mist, seemed even more desolate. He walked through the paths, his eyes scanning every corner for the old woman, but there was no sign of her. He felt a sense of helplessness he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Excuse me," Ethan called out to the cemetery caretaker, an elderly man wearing a wool cap sweeping the fallen leaves near the entrance. "I'm looking for an elder woman I saw here a few days ago. She came to visit Emily Sawyer grave. Have you seen her?" The man looked up slowly and observed him curiously before nodding. "Are you talking about Mildred Garcia?" he asked in a raspy voice. "She comes here every Sunday without fail, always at dusk. She brings flowers and stays for a long time in front of the grave." He paused, frowning. "She's been doing the same for years and never misses a visit." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. So Mildred had been visiting his mother's grave long before he saw her that night in the park. There was something strange about that devotion, about the ritual the old woman followed, as if it were a form of penance. "Do you know where I can find her?" Ethan insisted. The caretaker slowly shook his head. "I don't know, sir. Sometimes she talks to me, but she's never told me where she lives. All I know is that she used to leave little notes at your mother's grave, always Instagrammed with the initials IG. She would hide them among the flowers when no one was looking." The man shrugged, looking downcast. "But she stopped doing that a while ago. Maybe she felt guilty." Ethan frowned and looked around, assessing the area. If Mildred had been leaving notes, perhaps there was still something to be found. He headed to Emily's grave and, with his heart pounding, moved. Some of the wilted flowers aside, what he saw left him cold. A small, carefully folded piece of paper faded from time. He unfolded it. With trembling fingers, it was a short note written in shaky handwriting, Instagrammed with the initials the caretaker had mentioned. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I should never have told Richard. I should never have let him drag you into his world. It was all my fault. I hope that one day you can forgive me." Ethan felt as if the paper were burning his hands. He stared at the note, unable to process the intensity of guilt pouring from those words. Mildred hadn't just betrayed his mother. Her betrayal had condemned Emily to a life of suffering with a man who controlled her and ultimately destroyed her. It was more than Ethan could bear. Breathing heavily, he folded the note and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. He left the meetery with determined steps, a single thought hammering in his mind. He had to find Mildred and make her tell him everything. The woman was the only one who knew the whole truth, and that he would need help. Lauren was at home when Ethan showed up unannounced. She lived. Trembling fingers, it was a short note written in shaky handwriting, Instagrammed with the initials the caretaker had mentioned. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I should never have told Richard. I should never have let him drag you into his world. It was all my fault. I hope that one day you can forgive me." Ethan felt as if the paper were burning his hands. He stared at the note, unable to process the intensity of guilt pouring from those words. Mildred hadn't just betrayed his mother. Her betrayal had condemned Emily to a life of suffering with a man who controlled her and ultimately destroyed her. It was more than Ethan could bear. Breathing heavily, he folded the note and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. He left the meetery with determined steps, a single thought hammering in his mind. He had to find Mildred and make her tell him everything. The woman was the only one who knew the whole truth, and that he would need help. Lauren was at home when Ethan showed up unannounced. She lived. Trembling fingers, it was a short note written in shaky handwriting, Instagrammed with the initials the caretaker had mentioned. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I should never have told Richard. I should never have let him drag you into his world. It was all my fault. I hope that one day you can forgive me." Ethan felt as if the paper were burning his hands. He stared at the note, unable to process the intensity of guilt pouring from those words. Mildred hadn't just betrayed his mother. Her betrayal had condemned Emily to a life of suffering with a man who controlled her and ultimately destroyed her. It was more than Ethan could bear. Breathing heavily, he folded the note and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. He left the meetery with determined steps, a single thought hammering in his mind. He had to find Mildred and make her tell him everything. The woman was the only one who knew the whole truth, and that he would need help. Lauren was at home when Ethan showed up unannounced. She lived. Trembling fingers. It was a short note written in shaky handwriting, Instagrammed with the initials the caretaker had mentioned. Emily, I'm so sorry. I should never have told Richard. I should never have let him drag you into his world. It was all my fault. I hope that one day you can forgive me. Ethan felt as if the paper were burning his hands. He stared at the note, unable to process the intensity of guilt pouring from those words. Mildred hadn't just betrayed his mother. Her betrayal had condemned Emily to a life of suffering with a man who controlled her and ultimately destroyed her. It was more than Ethan could bear. Breathing heavily, he folded the note and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. He left the meetery with determined steps, a single thought hammering in his mind. He had to find Mildred and make her tell him everything. Lauren took a deep breath and ran her hand through her hair, struggling to regain control of her emotions. But we have no idea where she is, she replied, her voice returning to a cold and practical tone. We have no leads, no address, nothing. She could be anywhere. Ethan smiled faintly and pulled out another small piece of paper he had found alongside the first one. Not quite. He handed her the paper, pointing to a name at the bottom. Patricia Avala, Mildred's granddaughter, die. Lauren narrowed her eyes in surprise. The granddaughter, she repeated slowly. Do you think she can help us? She's our only option, Ethan affirmed. If we find Patricia, we find Mildred, and if we find Mildred, we'll uncover the truth that's been hidden from us all these years. Lauren's face hardened again, determination blazing in her dark eyes. All right, she agreed, firmly. We'll find that woman and finally learn the truth. Ethan felt a spark of hope ignite within him, despite all the pain, the resentment, the distance that had separated them. For the first time in decades, they were united in a common goal to uncover the truth about their mother and unearth the dark secrets of their family. They left the apartment together, leaving behind their doubts and fears. The past had come back to confront them, and they were ready to face it no matter what they found. Finding Patricia Aval wasn't as easy as they had hoped. Ethan and Lauren spent days making calls, tracking records, and visiting neighborhoods that seemed to fit the young woman's profile. The only lead they had was her name, found in an old letter hidden among their mother's belongings. Finally, a contact of Lauren's at the civil registry managed to locate Patricia. She lived in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts with her grandmother, Mildred Garcia. The day they finally arrived at the small house on the outskirts, Ethan and Lauren exchanged nervous glances before stepping out of the car. The neighborhood was made up of rundown houses and narrow streets, an image of decay and abandonment that contrasted sharply with the lives they were used to. They stopped in front of a humble house with gray walls and a small front garden filled with neglected plants. The wooden door was chipped and the windows were closed, covered with worn curtains. Are you sure this is the right thing to do? Ethan murmured, feeling as if every step he took brought him closer to an unknown abyss. Lauren nodded. Seriously, we have to do it. She replied, if we don't get the truth today, we never will. And Mom, she paused, her voice faltering, Mom deserves for us to know what really happened. Ethan swallowed hard and with a final sigh of determination knocked on the door. After a few seconds, the door slowly opened and a young girl with brown hair tied in a messy ponytail appeared. She looked about 16 and wore an oversized t-shirt that made her look even smaller and more fragile. Her dark eyes studied them with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "Who are you?" the girl asked, frowning. "Hello, Patricia." Ethan tried to sound as calm as possible. "We Ethan and Lane Sawyer. We'd like to speak with your grandmother, Mildred Garcia. Is she home?" The girl tensed at the mention of their names, as if the mention of her grandmother had alerted her to something. She glanced sideways into the house before responding cautiously. "Why do you want to talk to her?" Patricia asked suspiciously, narrowing her eyes. Lauren stepped forward, trying to appear friendly. "Please, we just want to ask her some questions about someone we both knew very well. Emily Sawyer, she was our mother." Patricia remained silent, watching them closely. Something in her expression changed. At the mention of Emily's name, she seemed to hesitate, as if torn between loyalty to. Hair tied in a messy ponytail appeared. She looked about 16 and wore an oversized t-shirt that made her look even smaller and more fragile. Her dark eyes studied them with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "Who are you?" the girl asked, frowning. "Hello, Patricia." Ethan tried to sound as calm as possible. "We Ethan and Lane Sawyer. We'd like to speak with your grandmother, Mildred Garcia. Is she home?" The girl tensed at the mention of their names, as if the mention of her grandmother had alerted her to something. She glanced sideways into the house before responding cautiously. "Why do you want to talk to her?" Patricia asked suspiciously, narrowing her eyes. Lauren stepped forward, trying to appear friendly. "Please, we just want to ask her some questions about someone we both knew very well. Emily Sawyer, she was our mother." Patricia remained silent, watching them closely. Something in her expression changed. At the mention of Emily's name, she seemed to hesitate, as if torn between loyalty to. Hair tied in a messy ponytail appeared. She looked about 16 and wore an oversized t-shirt that made her look even smaller and more fragile. Her dark eyes studied them with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "Who are you?" the girl asked, frowning. "Hello, Patricia." Ethan tried to sound as calm as possible. "We Ethan and Lane Sawyer. We'd like to speak with your grandmother, Mildred Garcia. Is she home?" The girl tensed at the mention of their names, as if the mention of her grandmother had alerted her to something. She glanced sideways into the house before responding cautiously. "Why do you want to talk to her?" Patricia asked suspiciously, narrowing her eyes. Lauren stepped forward, trying to appear friendly. "Please, we just want to ask her some questions about someone we both knew very well. Emily Sawyer, she was our mother." Patricia remained silent, watching them closely. Something in her expression changed. At the mention of Emily's name, she seemed to hesitate, as if torn between loyalty to. Hair tied in a messy ponytail appeared. She looked about 16 and wore an oversized t-shirt that made her look even smaller and more fragile. Her dark eyes studied them with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "Who are you?" the girl asked, frowning. "Hello, Patricia." Ethan tried to sound as calm as possible. "We Ethan and Lane Sawyer. We'd like to speak with your grandmother, Mildred Garcia. Is she home?" The girl tensed at the mention of their names, as if the mention of her grandmother had alerted her to something. She glanced sideways into the house before responding cautiously. "Why do you want to talk to her?" Patricia asked suspiciously, narrowing her eyes. Lauren stepped forward, trying to appear friendly. "Please, we just want to ask her some questions about someone we both knew very well. Emily Sawyer, she was our mother." Patricia remained silent, watching them closely. Only more pain. Weck decided that Lauren said, her voice breaking, but resolute. "Please, Mildred, we need to understand what happened to our mother. We need to know if Dad had something to do with the accident." Mildred pressed her lips, Together, her eyes flooded with a suffering so intense that Ethan felt a knot in his throat. The old woman took a deep breath before she began to speak. Her gaze lost in eyed some distant corner of the past. "Emily and I were like sisters," she began in a whisper. "I met her when we were both very young. She was always brave. She wasn't afraid of anything except losing the people she loved. And that's exactly what happened." The siblings remained silent, holding their breath. Emily fell in love with Henry Salazar. Mildred continued, her voice heavy with nostalgia. They were happy together. He didn't have money, but they didn't care. They planned to get married, have a modest life full of love, until Richard came along. Ethan felt anger welling up in his chest. He remembered his father's coldness, the way he always manipulated everyone around him. Richard was a dangerous man. Mildred went on. He wanted everything and didn't take no for an answer. He became obsessed with Emily. When she rejected him, he made Henry life a living hell. He shut down all his opportunities, ruined his business until he had nothing left. Lauren closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "And you?" she asked softly. "What did you do?" Mildred lowered her head, pain distorting her features. "I had a son, Roberto. He was all I had in the world. Richard threatened to harm him if I didn't tell him everything about Emily and Henry's plans." Tears streamed down her cheeks. I told him everything. Did it because I thought it would protect my son, but I ended up destroying everyone's lives." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Ethan felt his entire body tense after that. Mildred continued, trembling. "Emily married Richard to protect Henry. She thought that way he would leave her alone, but he didn't. Richard turned her into his prisoner, and when he realized she still planned to escape, Mildred stopped, her face contorted in anguish. "Richard went after her the night of the accident. Emily was trying to run away with my son Roberto, who had gone to get her to take her to Henry, but Richard caught up to them. He was furious, completely out of control. He rammed their car. And the rest." Her voice faded into a sob. Ethan stood paralyzed. Everything he had believed, all the anger and hatred toward his mother, was crumbling. Richard hadn't just torn Emily away from Henry, he had intentionally caused the accident that ended her life in Roberto's, and Henry. Lauren cried out desperately, "What happened to him?" Mildred shook her head, her eyes filled with pain. "It broke him. Richard forced him to leave to live in exile. He was never the same again. Emily died without ever seeing him again." She placed a trembling hand over her chest as if trying to contain the pain that was suffocating her. "And I was the one who started it all. That's why I deserve to be alone, frozen in the cold without the warmth of the jacket you gave me. I deserve to suffer." As she did, the words hung in the air like a knife. Ethan slowly stood up, his face pale and his gaze distant. Everything they thought they knew had changed in an instant. Lauren knelt beside Mildred, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for telling us. But we're not done yet. We're going to find Henry. If he's still alive, we need to talk to him. We need to put an end to this once and for all." Mildred nodded slowly, whispering, "One last confession. If you find him, tell him Emily never stopped loving him." And with that, the dark past of the Sawyer family began to unravel, completely leaving the siblings face to face with a devastating truth that would change their lives forever. Mildred Garcia's confession echoed in Ethan and Lauren's minds like a haunting refrain. As they drove back to the city, Ethan could barely focus on the road, his eyes distant, his mind replaying every word the old woman had spoken over and over again. Their mother had been a prisoner in her own home, trapped by a man who slowly destroyed her, and all because Richard Sawyer couldn't accept a simple, "No, we have to find him." Lauren, Ethan murmured, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Henry is the last piece of this puzzle. If there was something more that night, if there's anything we don't know yet, he could be the one to tell us." Lauren nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the road ahead of them. Despite the pain and anger churning within her, there was a new determination in her expression, a desire for justice burning for the first time in many years. But Mildred said Dad forced him to leave, she replied. Thoughtfully, Richard had enough power to ruin anyone's life. If Henry really ran away, he could be anywhere. What if we never find him? Ethan sighed and shook his head. We'll find him. The words sounded like a promise. No matter how long it takes, with that resolve in mind, the Sawyer siblings began an exhaustive search. They spent days sifting through old files, contacting people who might have known Henry Salazar and visiting places that had once been part of their mother's life. They discovered that Henry had disappeared shortly after the accident, leaving no trace. Richard Sawyer had used all his influence to erase any connection to him, as if he wanted to eliminate even the memory of his existence. Yet amid all the closed doors, a small ray of hope emerged in the most unexpected place. Lauren, using her access at the law firm where she worked, decided to review old property records and financial documents linked to their father. What she found was surprising. Years before the accident, Richard had bought several properties under third-party names, but one in particular caught her attention. The property, located in a small rural town outside the city, had been in Henry Salazar's name until he disappeared. Suddenly, I think we found something, Lauren said, looking up at Ethan as they sat in the small archive room at the firm. Dad was transferring money to this property for years, even after the accident. Then, a few months before he died, it all stopped. Ethan frowned, studying the documents intently. Are you saying Dad was still sending him money, even after Mom died? He asked incredulously. Lauren nodded, biting her lower lip. It seems so. It makes no sense unless Dad was. She paused, as if the words were too difficult to say. Unless he was buying Henry's silence. Ethan felt a surge of fury wash over him. What else had Richard done to ensure their mother never found peace? How many lives had he destroyed? Where is this property? He asked urgently. Lauren reviewed the details in the papers and pointed to a small name in the margin of one of the documents. It's in a place called Santa Elena, a town about 2 hours from here outside the city. If Henry hid there, maybe someone still remembers him. Without hesitation, they set out, leaving behind the impersonal coldness of the city and heading into a rural landscape that grew increasingly melancholic as they drove on Santa. Elena turned out to be a small, forgotten town with old brick houses and deserted streets. Most of the shops were closed, and the few residents they saw watched them with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. They stopped in front of a small local tavern. Their only hope of getting information as they entered the quiet, smoky atmosphere was interrupted by the sound of their footsteps. A couple of old men sitting at the bar looked up, watching them. With interest, Ethan approached the man behind the counter, an elderly man wearing a dirty apron and a weary expression. Excuse me, we're looking for a man who lived here many years ago. Ethan began, trying to sound calm. Henry Salazar, does that name ring a bell? The bartender narrowed his eyes, evaluating them with suspicion. And who are you? He asked, in a gruff voice. Lauren pulled out the photo of their mother with Henry and showed it to him with trembling hands. We, the children of Emily Sawyer. She was a friend of Henry's. We need to find him to understand what happened to our mother. The name Emily seemed to have an immediate effect on the man. His eyes softened, and he looked at the photograph thoughtfully. After a long silence, he nodded slowly. Henry lived here, yes. He was a good man, always quiet, reserved. Nobody knew much about him. He came about years ago, and then he paused, frowning. He left, disappeared about years ago, without a trace. Years. Ethan repeated, feeling hope slipping away. Do you know where he went? The bartender shook his head. He only left a letter, said he couldn't keep running anymore. He talked about going back to a place that meant a lot to him, a place where everything began. Lauren and Ethan exchanged confused. "Looks a place where everything began?" Lauren asked, perplexed. "What does that mean?" The man shrugged, but one of the old men at the bar leaned forward. Santa Elena was never his home. The raspy voiced man said he always talked about his family's farm, a place on the outskirts of the city. Said that's where he met the only woman he ever loved. Maybe that's what he meant. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. The farm. His mother had often mentioned an old farm when she talked about her youth, a place she used to escape to whenever she wanted to be alone. Could that be the place with renewed determination? They headed to the outskirts of the city toward the old farm where Emily and Henry had met. The path was overgrown, and the building looked dilapidated, like a ghost from the past. When they arrived, they got out of the car and stood gazing at the abandoned house, a shadow of what it once was. Ethan moved forward with hesitant steps. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze as they stepped inside. Dust swirled around them, and a strong smell of dampness filled the air. But then a figure shifted in the dim light. "Who's there?" A weak, hoarse voice asked. Ethan froze, holding his breath there, standing among the shadows. A thin hunchman looked at them with eyes full of surprise and weariness. His grey hair fell messily over his forehead, and his expression was that of someone who had long stopped, expecting company. "Henry," Ethan whispered, unable to believe what he was seeing. The man blinked as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and then very slowly he nodded. Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We're the children of Emily Sawyer," Lauren said, her voice tight with emotion. "And we've come to find the truth." Henry's eyes filled with tears. He looked at Ethan, then at Lauren, and his expression shifted from shock to an infinite sadness. "Emily," he murmured, "my Emily." He brought his hands to his face, as if the weight of all those years were crushing him. "I thought I'd never hear her name again." Ethan took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Henry. "Please tell us the truth. Tell us what really happened that night." Henry looked at them in silence for a long time, and then, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life, he nodded. "All right, I'll tell you everything, but be prepared, because the truth is much darker than you can imagine." And so the man who had loved their mother began to speak, unearthing a past filled with tragedies and secrets that would forever change the way Ethan and Lauren saw their family and themselves. The farm, with its cracked walls and atmosphere of decay, was the place where Emily and Henry's love story had begun, and now it seemed to be the place where it would all come to an end. Henry Salazar sat down slowly. On an old wooden chair, his trembling hands resting in his lap. The years of hiding and running had taken their toll, but his eyes were still filled with the same pain and love he had felt the day he lost the woman of his life. Ethan and Lauren watched in silence, holding their breath. They had found the final piece of the puzzle the man Richard Sawyer had tried to destroy, but judging by the sorrow on Henry's face, the real damage hadn't been physical, it had been emotional, and every word he spoke now would be like digging up a secret that had been buried for decades. "I never thought I'd see you," Henry murmured, his voice broken with emotion. "The last time I saw your mother." He paused, placing a hand over his chest as if trying to calm the pain that still pierced through him. "She told me she wouldn't give up, that she would find a way to come back to me." Lauren leaned forward, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "What happened that night, Henry?" she asked softly, almost fearfully. "We need to know." The old man nodded slowly, his gaze lost somewhere in the past. "Emily and I were planning to run away together," he confessed, his voice tinged with both nostalgia and bitterness. "We were going to leave everything behind and start over. But Richard was like a shadow that never stopped stalking us. From the moment he found out about our plans. He did everything he could to destroy me. He ruined my career, accused me of thefts I never committed. And in the end, he forced me to disappear to keep Emily safe. She thought that if she married him, she could protect me, and I... His voice broke. I was a coward. I left her alone. It wasn't your fault. Ethan whispered, moved. By the man's despair, he was a monster. He manipulated all of us. No, I abandoned her when she needed me. Most Henry insisted, his eyes filled with tears. But even after marrying him, Emily never stopped trying to escape. We wrote to each other in secret. We met a few times. She promised me she would come to me when things settled down. And then the night of the accident, he closed his eyes tightly as if reliving that moment was, too painful. She was finally going to do it. She was going to run away. Roberto, Mildred's son, offered to take her to me. Ethan and Lauren exchanged stunned looks. The truth was unfolding before them like a canvas of pain and tragedy. But Richard found them. Lauren murmured, completing the story. Didn't. Henry nodded, his hands trembling violently. Yes. Richard chased them. He was out of his mind like a demon. He caught up to them on a back road and his voice faded into a whisper. He tried to force Emily to come back with him when she refused, when she told him she was leaving and wasn't afraid to stand up to him. He rammed their car. He drove them off the road. Roberto's car went down the slope and crashed into a tree. Lauren sobbed, covering her mouth with her hand. My God, she whispered, all this time we thought it was an accident. It wasn't. Henry confirmed, bitterness lacing his voice. Richard planned it. He wanted to destroy Emily. If he couldn't have her, he'd rather see her dead. And when he saw what he had done, when he saw the blood, he brought a hand to his eyes, squeezing them shut. He stopped. He got out of his car and looked at Emily, not like a horrified husband, but like a man who had just lost his last trophy. Ethan felt his entire body tense. The image of his Father, always cold and calculated, blurred, turning into that of a ruthless monster capable of ruining everything he touched. How do you know all this? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Henry looked at him, and in his eyes there was something more than pain. There was anger, and there was truth. Because I was there, he said slowly. I arrived shortly after it happened. I saw Richard pull her out of the wrecked car and just stare at her as she lay dying. Henry took a shaky breath, fighting not to break down. I got there too late to save her, but Emily's last word was my name. His lips trembled with a mix of despair and rage. I hid when I heard Richard talking to Mildred on the phone. He ordered her to lie, to say it was an accident, that there was no one left to dispute his version. Lauren buried her face in her hands, her body trembling with rage and pain. Ethan, on the other hand, felt a cold chill run down his spine. This time he murmured, unable to process the horror of what he was hearing. He made us hate her. He made us think she was weak, that she didn't want to be with us. Henry shook his head slowly. No, she never stopped loving you. Everything she did was to protect you. She knew that if she tried to run away with you, Richard would hurt you. That's why she agreed to stay. That's why his voice broke. That's why she sacrificed her happiness for you. The three of them remained silent, wrapped in a shared pain. Ethan felt something inside him shatter. Everything he had believed about his mother. All the hatred and guilt vanished, leaving a deep, dark void. His mother hadn't been a passive victim. She had been a fighter, a woman who sacrificed everything to protect them. She asked me to look after you, Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. But I failed. Richard found me and forced me to disappear. He blackmailed me, threatening to harm Mildred and her family if I ever tried to come near you again. In the end, I hid here, waiting for the day he trailed off. looking at Ethan and Lauren with a mix of sadness and longing, waiting to see you so I could finally tell you the truth. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the tears finally spill over all. The anger, the guilt, the bitterness, none of it mattered anymore. His mother had died, loving a man she could never have, trapped in a marriage that slowly destroyed her, and the only way to honor her memory was to do what she never could: redeem the Sawyer family name. Lauren wiped her tears and slowly approached Henry, kneeling in front of him. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for loving her, for trying to save her, even if you couldn't." Henry looked at her, his eyes brimming with tears. "I wasn't strong enough," he murmured, his voice choked with sobs. Lauren shook her head. You were stronger than you could ever imagine." She took his hands gently. "Now the only way to make amends is to tell the truth, to share everything that happened so that Mom can finally rest in peace." Henry looked at her, his heart breaking, but in the end, he nodded slowly. "Yes, it's the only thing I can do now." As the three of them sat in the old farmhouse, the past felt less oppressive. Ethan glanced at, and Henry, sensing that despite everything they had reached some sort of resolution, the monster who had ruled their lives was dead, but his shadow still loomed over them. It was time to bring the truth to light, to dismantle Richard Sawyer, legacy of hatred, and finally give their mother the respect and love she always deserved. The redemption of the Sawyer siblings had just begun. Ethan and Lauren returned to the city with heavy hearts and minds full of conflicting thoughts. Henry Salazar's revelation had been devastating, but at the same time, it had given them something they hadn't felt in years: clarity. They finally understood who their mother really was and how much she had fought for them, but knowing the truth wasn't enough. Now they had to decide what to do with it. "Are you going to expose it all?" Ethan asked as they drove back to Lauren's apartment. The road, shrouded in the dimness of twilight, seemed a symbol of the uncertainty surrounding them. Lauren looked at him, frowning, still struggling to control the emotions simmering beneath the surface. "I want to scream it from the rooftops," she admitted, her voice laced with anger. "I want everyone to know what he did. Richard destroyed lives and manipulated everyone around him. I can't let people go on believing he was a good man." But she paused, sighing in frustration. "I also think about Mildred. If the truth comes out, she and Patricia will pay the price. Dad's image is the only thing still keeping them safe, even if it's built on a lie." Ethan nodded, silently understanding his sister's dilemma. Mildred had been the traitor in their mother's story, but she was also a victim of circumstances. Richard had used fear and desperation to force her to betray her friend's life, and afterward he kept her in the shadows for decades, controlling her with threats and blackmail. "So what do we do?" Ethan asked. Finally, Lauren looked at him with a determination he hadn't seen in her for a long time. "The first thing we need to do is talk to Mildred and Patricia." His sister's voice softened. "We can't decide anything without them. After all, Mildred deserves the chance to redeem herself too." Ethan nodded, realizing it was only fair. Mildred had spent her entire life regretting what she'd done, though she couldn't erase the past. Maybe she could find some semblance of peace if they involved her in the next steps. Mildred's small house looked even more run-down than the last time they had seen it. The garden, plants were withered, and the brick facade seemed darker under the waning light of dusk. Ethan and Lauren stepped out of the car with nervousness. There was a palpable tension in the air as they climbed the steps to the door. They knocked gently, and this time it was Patricia who answered. The young girl looked at them with eyes full of curiosity and weariness. There hadn't been time to talk to her last time, but now everything felt different. "My grandmother is inside," she said without needing to ask who they were. She opened the door fully and let them in. Ethan looked around the interior more closely than before. It was a modest place, small and cozy in its own way, but permeated with an air of sadness. The walls were lined with black and white photographs, some so old that the faces were barely visible. Mildred was sitting in an armchair by the window, wrapped in a blanket, when she saw them enter. Her eyes widened in surprise, then shifted to a mixture of resignation and fear. Did you find Henry?" she asked in a trembling voice. Ethan nodded slowly and sat down in a chair across from her. Lauren remained standing, beside him, arms crossed, and her gaze fixed on the old woman. "Yes," Ethan responded softly. "We spoke to him. He told us everything that happened that night. We know the truth, Mildred." Mildred visibly trembled. She brought a trembling hand to her chest as if trying to calm a pain that had been buried for far too long. "Then why are you here?" she whispered. I was the one who started all this. You should hate me. You have no reason to ever see me again." Lauren stepped forward, her expression stern but not devoid of compassion. "That's true." She admitted, "You're right about a lot of things, but you were also a victim of my father." She paused, her dark, intense eyes fixed on the elderly woman. "We're not here to seek revenge on you. We're here to talk about what happens next. We need to decide what to do with all of this." Mill looked at them in disbelief. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back, her face tense with pain. "There's nothing you can do," she murmured. "My betrayal killed Emily. There's no redemption for me. It doesn't matter how many times I visit her grave or how many tears I shed, nothing can bring her back. We can't bring her back," Ethan said, his voice firm but full of sadness. "But we can make sure that what Richard did to her doesn't remain hidden. We want to tell the truth, Mildred, but we want to do it with your consent." Patricia, who had been listening in silence, stepped forward, her eyes shining with concern. "What will happen to us if you do that?" she asked, her voice tense. "My grandmother has always been afraid that if people knew the truth, we'd lose everything. Would it ruin us?" Lauren exchanged a glance with Ethan before responding. "If we reveal everything, there could be repercussions," she admitted. "But there's another option. We can clear our mother's name without destroying our family." She paused, looking at both women intently. "We don't want revenge. We just want people to know who she really was." Mildred lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping as if she carried an impossible burden. She seemed caught in an internal conflict. Ethan watched the struggle. In her eyes, the desire to redeem herself mixed with the fear of exposing her granddaughter to danger. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up at them. "If that's what you want to do, I'll support you," she said in a weak but resolute voice. "I don't know how I can help, but I'll do whatever is necessary." Ethan and Lauren exchanged a look of relief. "Thank you," Ethan said sincerely. "But Mildred, before we make a decision, we need you to meet with Henry. He also wants the truth to come out, but he believes you both need to do it together." Mildred's eyes widened with shock and fear. "Henry," she murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. I can't face him after everything I did. He will hate me." Ethan shook his head slowly. "He doesn't hate you, Mildred. Henry has spent his entire life waiting for this moment, hoping that the two of you could make peace with the past." He paused, looking at her intently. "Please come with us to see him. Let us give you that chance." Patricia, who had been silently watching, placed a hand on her grandmother's shoulder. "Grandma," she whispered softly, "you have to do this. You can't keep living with this pain. If you don't face it, now you'll never find peace." Mildred looked at her, her face wet with tears. Her lips trembled as she slowly nodded. "All right," she murmured. "I'll do whatever it takes to redeem myself." 2 days later, Ethan and Lauren accompanied Mildred and Patricia to Henry's farm. The journey was tense, filled with suppressed emotions when they finally arrived. The farm loomed before them, somber and silent in the surrounding fields. Henry was already waiting at the entrance, standing with the help of a can. his expression tense with anxiety. Ethan helped Mild out of the car, and the elderly woman stood still for a moment, staring at Henry with a face full of fear and regret. Then very slowly she approached him, her hands trembling. "Henry," she whispered, her voice breaking, I just want to say I'm sorry. There's nothing I can say to make it better, but I'm so sorry." Henry looked at her in silence for what seemed like an eternity then. Slowly he shook his head. "You didn't do it out of malice, Mildred," he murmured softly. "You did it out of fear. Richard manipulated all of us. I don't hate you. I never did." Mildred let out a sob, and without thinking knelt in front of him, whispering apologies over and over again. Moved, Henry leaned forward as much as he could and lifted her up, hugging her tenderly. It was a fragile embrace filled with years of pain and regret. Ethan and Lauren watched the scene, their eyes brimming with tears, feeling that the cycle of hatred and betrayal Richard had created was finally beginning to break. "We're going to tell the truth," Lauren said softly. "We're going to tell everyone who our mother was and who Richard really was, and we'll do it together as a family." Patricia, standing beside them, watched the scene with a mixture of relief and hope. Maybe, just maybe, this truth would not only end her grandparents' suffering, but also mark the beginning of something new as the sun set over the farm, bathing everything in golden hues. Ethan knew that they were finally on the right path. The past couldn't be changed, but the future, the legacy of Emily Sawyer, was in their hands, and whatever they did from now on would be in her honor. The days following the reunion at the farm were filled with a tense calm. Ethan, Lauren, Mildred, Henry and Patricia met several times to discuss the next step, fully aware that any decision they made could have huge repercussions on their lives. But finally they all reached a consensus. The truth had to come out, not as an act of revenge, but as a tribute to Emily Sawyer, a woman who had been misunderstood and condemned by secrets and lies. The first step was to organize a private meeting with the few people close to the Sawyer family and those who had known Richard. It wasn't a large audience, but it consisted of influential people, business partners, and old family friends. Lauren and Ethan knew this was just the beginning, and that the most important part would be how they told the story to the public. But they wanted to start with those who had kept Richard's false image alive. The day of the meeting. It was held at the old Sawyer residence, an imposing mansion that had once symbolized Richard's wealth and power. Now the house seemed too big and empty, a reminder of the coldness and shadows that had dwelled within. The irony of choosing that place wasn't lost on Ethan or Lauren. They were going to unearth the truth at the heart of Richard's greatest lie. The lights in the main hall were on, and the large windows left in the natural light, creating an atmosphere of clarity, as if even the house itself was prepared for this act of revelation. The guests arrived dressed formally, murmuring with curiosity and confusion when they saw the Sawyer siblings standing by the fireplace next to Mildred and Henry. No one knew what to expect from this gathering. When everyone was seated, Lauren, with a knot in her stomach, cleared her throat. She wore a simple black dress with no adornments, and her face reflected an unshakable determination. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice echoing in the silent hall. "Today we're here to talk about our mother, Emily Sawyer, and who our father, Richard Sawyer, really was." A murmur ran through the room, but Lauren raised her hand, asking for silence. "I know many of you knew him as a respectable businessman, a man of principles and values, but that is not the whole truth." Lauren took a deep breath. "Our father was a man consumed by jealousy and obsession. He was a man who didn't hesitate to destroy lives to keep my mother by his side. Even if it meant breaking her." Shock was evident on the faces of those present. Some exchanged incredulous glances, but Lauren didn't stop. She pulled out Emily's letter, the one she had found hidden among Mildred's things, and held it up. "This letter was written by our mother shortly before she died. In it, She reveals that Richard forced her to marry him to keep her away from the man she truly loved, Henry Salazar. My mother was not an unfaithful wife or a weak woman. She was a victim of manipulation and abuse. Ethan stepped forward, his hands firmly clasped in front of him, and it was more than that. Ethan's voice was low but intense. Richard caused the accident that killed her. It wasn't a random event. It was an act of revenge. When she tried to escape with Henry, he chased her and deliberately rammed their car until it veered off the road. Gasps of horror filled the room. Some people covered their mouths in disbelief. The murmurs grew until they became a cacophony of voices. Lauren raised her voice, her tone firm and commanding. "Silence," she ordered, and the people fell silent, watching her attentively. "We're not here to ask for sympathy or to destroy our father's memory. We're here to give justice to our mother. We want you to know who she really was and to stop remembering her as a broken, manipulated woman. She was strong, brave, and she died fighting for us." Ethan looked at Mildred and Henry, who were sitting to the side watching the scene with eyes full of suppressed emotions. Mildred slowly stood up, her trembling hands resting on the back of her chair. The room fell completely silent as the old woman spoke. "I was the one responsible for all of this," Mildred said in a broken voice. "I told Richard about Emily and Henry's plans because I was afraid he threatened to take my son away, and I did what he asked. But I never wanted things to end like this." She placed a trembling hand over her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I've spent my whole life regretting that moment. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want people to know that Emily was never to blame. All she wanted was to be happy." Henry stood up after her, his gaze fixed on the stunned faces of the audience. "And I was the coward who gave up," he said bitterly. "When Richard forced me to disappear, I didn't fight for her again." His eyes filled with tears. "But now I finally have the chance to tell the truth. Emily was the love of my life. All she ever did was try to protect us all." He looked at Ethan and Lauren with gratitude, and these two brave children of hers, they are her true legacy. Thanks to them, the truth will finally be known. The silence that followed was so profound that Ethan could almost hear his own heartbeat. But then someone in the crowd started clapping. Then another person joined, and within seconds the entire room was applauding. It wasn't a loud or triumphant applause. It was slow and solemn. An acknowledgement that they had heard something honest and deeply moving. Ethan and Lauren looked at each other, their eyes filled with tears. They had done what they set out to do. They had revealed the truth. Their mother at last could rest in peace. As the days passed, the story began to spread. The Sawyer family used their connections to create a complete and truthful narrative, leaving no part of Emily's story untold. They published their mother's letter and spoke publicly about their father's abuse and manipulation. Mildred and Henry also shared their testimonies, making it clear that Emily had been a strong and determined woman who was betrayed by those who were supposed to protect her. The truth was not received without controversy. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the idealized image of Richard, but most accepted the truth with sadness and resignation. Companies and properties that bore Richard's name began distancing themselves from his legacy, and the Sawyer family decided to sell the mansion and the remaining assets to close that dark chapter for good. What they did with the money surprised many. They created a foundation in Emily Sawyer's name, dedicated to helping women trying to escape abusive relationships. Mildred, with a trembling voice, was the first to donate her savings to the cause, insisting that it was the least she could do. Patricia became the youth representative of the foundation, committed to continuing the legacy of a grandmother who, despite her mistakes, had sought redemption on the day of the foundation's inauguration. Ethan and Lauren stood in front of the newly renovated building, looking. By those who were supposed to protect her, the truth was not received without controversy. Some refused to believe it, clinging to the idealized image of Richard, but most accepted the truth with sadness and resignation companies. And properties that bore Richard's name began distancing themselves from his legacy, and the Sawyer family decided to sell the mansion and the remaining assets to close that dark chapter for good. What they did with the money surprised many. They created a foundation in Emily Sawyer's name, dedicated to helping women trying to escape abusive relationships. Mildred, with a trembling voice, was the first to donate her savings to the cause, insisting that it was the least she could do. Patricia became the youth representative of the foundation, committed to continuing the legacy of a grandmother who, despite her mistakes, had sought redemption on the day of the foundation's inauguration. Ethan and Lauren stood in front of the newly renovated building, looking at the plaque they had placed at the entrance in memory of Emily Sawyer, a brave woman who never stopped fighting. As they walked away, holding hands, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace, the peace of knowing they had done the right thing, that they had finally honored their mother's memory in the way she would have wanted, and although the pain would never completely disappear, they knew that wherever their mother was, she was smiling, knowing that her children had broken the cycle of hatred and lies. The legacy of truth had begun, and with it, a new chapter for the Sawyer family, one built on the strength, love, and justice that had always been at the heart of Emily. And so that concludes our story for today. If you liked it and want to hear more stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next videos filled with emotion and life lessons. See you in the next one. Take care and never stop searching for the truth.